Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a few seconds for people to come in. We're going to have a large audience this evening, so we want to make sure everyone gets in before I start my introductory remarks. If you want to go into the chat, tell us where you're tuning in from. That'd be really awesome. Start a conversation with each other. We have someone from Denver and a little closer to home in Simsbury and even closer in West Hartford. All right, we still have about half the audience we're supposed to have. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, I'm Omar Acevedo and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to host tonight's program. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and our other virtual programs. Now, let me introduce our guests. Tonight, we are welcoming Gary Weiss and Dan Haar for a discussion of Retail Gangster, the insane real-life story of Crazy Eddie. Gary's new biography of Eddie Antar, better known as Crazy Eddie, whose home electronics empire changed the world, even as it turned out to be one of the biggest business scams of all time. Our moderator is Dan Haar. He is a columnist and associate editor at Hearst, Connecticut Media, writing about the intersection of business, public policy, and politics and how the issues affect the people of Connecticut. Our author is Gary Weiss. He is a native of New York City. He graduated from City College and the Middle School of Journalism at Northwestern University. He has worked as a writer and reporter at the Hartford Courant, Barron's, Business Week, and Condé Nast Portfolio. Gary wrote some of the first articles exploring the internet explosion and its impact on investors. He also was one of the first journalists to explore the growing power and influence of hedge funds. He has written profiles of major figures in global finance and has been uncovering Wall Street wrongdoing for nearly 2 decades. We encourage you to have a conversation in the chat along with our guests. If you have a specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. So please sit back and enjoy. I'm going to turn it over to Dan and Gary, and I'm just going to turn on their cameras and let them have a conversation.
Okay.
Hiya, folks.
Are we on? There we go. There we go. I got to start my video. There we go. Okay.
There you go.
We're underway. Thank you, Omar. Thank you very much for that. I'm pleased to have known Frank Lord, and I'm glad to be part of any the programming that has his name attached to it. And welcome to everyone. Can you see me okay? It's I can.
I can see you. Can you see me?
So we're talking about the great Crazy Eddie empire that came and left during many of our lifetimes. And let's start by talking about the story with an eye toward the fact that Crazy Eddie, and everybody calls it Crazy Eddies, but it's Crazy Eddie, the company, and Eddie Antar, were oddly very, very, very well known. But even at the time, we didn't know much about the man, Eddie Antar. He managed to stay, for the most part, out of the publicity circle. And so let's talk about, Gary, what happened and where does this stand in the panoply of great retail innovations? Let's just go over a little bit of overview of the story.
Well, first I want to thank you guys for having me. This is real sort of a homecoming because I had my journalistic beginnings at the Hartford Courant with Dan, and back in the old Middletown Bureau, which I think no longer exists. So,
No, it doesn't.
it does not.
I'm afraid not.
No longer exists. Well,
No, that's another book
there's
that's going to
something
be
in common.
written. What's happened? That's a different book, but no, it doesn't.
It's another book. It's another
I
book.
was a photographer working in the bureau where Gary was a writer way back.
Way back.
Crazy Eddie's. Let's start with that year. Yeah, that period, late 70s. Crazy Eddie's was what?
Well, Crazy Eddie began, I should say that it really had its genesis in the 60s. It was a family business. It was a family business. It was founded by Eddie Antar, and it was basically bequeathed to Eddie by his father, Sam M. Antar. Eddie was he was like the sort of the scion of the Antar family, which was a Syrian Jewish family with its root in Aleppo, Syria. Among Syrian Jewish people, retail stores are sort of handed down from father to son. And Eddie was set up in business by his father, Sam M. Antar, on Kings Highway. That's a lower middle class district in Brooklyn. And Eddie was set up in the electronics business, which was very hot back in the 70s. He was set up actually in 1969 in the business. Very good timing in a way. Electronics was really booming. But Eddie had a problem. The problem that he wanted to go into high-end electronics. And the problem that he had was that the manufacturers were very picky about who they sold to, and they didn't like to sell to people who were cutting their prices. And the only way Eddie could make a buck, the only way he could get people into the store was by cutting his prices. And he couldn't do it by following the rules. So he did it by not following the rules. And that's what sort of is what the book is about, and how his not following the rules sort of over the years is sort of transmogrified from minor petty, some of it not so petty actually, from one form of law breaking, minor and serious law breaking, into a criminal enterprise. The beginning was, as I say, it was on Kings Highway in this low middle class region of Brooklyn, and he found that he could make money. He could cut prices and still make money by collecting sales tax and not passing it on to the government. That's 7% sales tax. That gave him profit margin.
I want to have you continue the story, but why was it possible then and this becomes one of the central frauds. There are a number in the book, there are a number of central frauds that come up. Later, we're going to see inventory be bloated so that it looks like they have more inventory. We're going to see all kinds of swindles. But that original swindle, not paying, why was that possible?
Well, it was possible because Eddie had the will to do it. It's illegal to take sales tax and put it in your pocket. You're supposed to pass it on to the government. That's tax fraud. That's a felony. He was willing to commit a felony to give himself an extra profit margin. And just skipping ahead to the future, he got away with it. He figured he could get away with it, and he did. He was able to collect 7% sales tax and get away with it. And that was sort of the central basis of the fraud. Collecting sales tax, not passing it on, doing a few other things that I get into in the book, and also his very aggressive sales technique, which he picked up as a teenager working in Times Square clip joints, those little shops that you see in Times Square. He learned how to sell in these clip joints, and he brought that into this electronics store. And so it was a combination of originally of tax fraud and very, very aggressive sales techniques, which then sort of mushroomed into other things, bait and switch and other things we can get into. But that was the nucleus, as you say. The nucleus was tax fraud, a felony.
So talk a little bit about the environment then in New York. Very gritty. Times Square didn't look like Disneyland. For those of us who remember, I see there's a Barbara Cohen who was there in Brooklyn in the 70s. That's fantastic, Barbara.
There you go.
And there are a lot of people, maybe some of us in the audience who remember that sort of grittier time. Tell us about how did that gritty time give rise to this type of enterprise?
Well, you have to remember, I mean, if you're old enough as I am to remember New York in the 60s, and I was in New York back in the 60s. I was going to high school and college and, you know, whatever. In those days, there was a lot of crime going on all the time, everywhere. Street crime, crime in the police precincts, police corruption, City Hall was corrupt. I mean, there was an atmosphere of corruption in the city. It was a very corrupt government. You know, I mean, after all, earlier in the 60s, they were able to make their budget by committing widespread accounting fraud in the city coffers. You know, so the government, the city of New York was sort of corrupt from the top to the bottom. Organized crime was very big in those days. So that was the environment. Eddie was not some sort of like outlier. You know, he's a crook, everybody else. No. He was part of the environment of New York City back in the 60s and 70s when crookedness was rampant. And of course, street crime was a nightmare. They talk about crime nowadays, you know, crime is going up, and oh my God, it's not like anything like it was back in the 60s and 70s when murders were so commonplace. Most of them didn't even get into the papers. Now at least you can get killed to get your name in the paper, but now you couldn't. It wouldn't happen back in the 60s.
Yes. So when does Crazy Eddie become Crazy Eddie? Like, see, there it is. I'm doing it. Am I doing this because of Mr. Carroll? When does Crazy Eddie become the Crazy Eddies that we know and love or hate?
Yeah, well, you know, he was able to break through by committing securities fraud, by his sales techniques, by bait and switch, and by a few other things, you know, that we can certainly get into. But then in the mid 70s, he was successful. You know, he was able to sort of do well. He started opening stores. He opened a couple of other stores. And then in 1976, he brought on a sales executive, a very, very young guy named Larry Weiss, no relation, Larry Weiss.
From Long Island.
From Long Island, from Massapequa or someplace like that. They bring on Jerry Carroll, and Jerry Carroll said, look, you know, we need to have a voice. Eddie needs a voice. Crazy Eddie was now called Crazy Eddie because Eddie was advertising his low prices, and he used the old crazy merchant shtick, which is as old as the hills, okay? So, it was, you know, they decided, look, we need to bring in some guy who's gonna be our spokesman. And that's when they brought in this guy, Jerry Carroll, who was a disc jockey, born in Yonkers, a disc jockey at WPIX-FM, and he was fantastic. So it was like marketing genius that they brought in this guy to do screaming commercials, which really it really resonated at that time in New York City for whatever reason. It's hard to explain. It resonated, and it resonates to this day because people nowadays, you know, they remember the crazy commercials, and that propelled Crazy Eddie all the way to the end in terms of sales, in terms of people going in buying. It made Crazy Eddie into a cultural icon.
And so right from the start, Crazy Eddie is part of the New York TV culture. And talk to us about how he got involved in late night TV. I thought that was a great passage. By the way, I should just make an aside. We've had a lot of conversations about various books, and I tend to talk about books about companies and Wall Street figures and economic history. This book doesn't read like that. It reads, and Gary and I talked about this earlier. It reads a little bit more like a sort of a mystery page turner. And we're going to get in a minute. There is a fellow who I was absolutely convinced that Gary was foreshadowing he was going to be the whistleblower, but he wasn't. But talk about that TV culture, late night TV.
Yeah, well, thanks for appreciate you saying that. I tell the story through the people involved, and one of the people who was brought in by Eddie. And Eddie was, you know, despite his criminality, he was a pretty bright guy in many ways. He knew who to hire and to hire the right people. We brought in some guy who came up with a great idea. He said, look, you know, at night, you can advertise for very little money. And, you know, like $10 a pop or $20 a pop, very, very little money. $20 per commercial spot, very, very little money. So it was decided, look, we're going to advertise throughout the night on like every single station that's possible. We're going to advertise. So even though our audiences are small, they figure, well, like everybody at some point or another has insomnia and can't sleep. And they figure, well, it's better to pound away at like 100 people 1,000 times than 1,000 people 10 times. The massive advertising at night, they took over the night. They took over the nighttime TV, so that all these old TV shows that they were showing at night, all these old movies, whatever, they had crazy Eddie commercials, one after the other after the other. Their advertising philosophy was repetition. Repetition. It was almost like brainwashing in a way, and it kind of worked. Really.
So a number of factors are all coming together in the mid 70s. You got the grittiness of New York. You got the inability of the city to police basic tax stuff. You've got the rise of this industry. The hippie culture has now grown up, and they want a stereo system, and it's got to be loud, and it's got to be cheap because they don't have great jobs. All these things are coming together. You've got a family business. It becomes a big phenomenon when they only have 2 or 3 or 4 stores, right? In other words, does that sort of replicate a cult following? Was there a cult of Crazy Eddie before there was corporate Crazy Eddie?
Yeah, I mean, they had more. Well, by the time the 80s rolled around, they had about 10 stores approximately. But every store opening was this big event. Now, this is even before Crazy Eddie, became a big corporation. They had 20,000 people at some of these store openings. They were phenomenal. The store openings, to this day, they talk about how they would line up. You never hear about a store. These were store openings. Nowadays, you hear about big store openings for the new iPod or whatever. So there's a lot of crowds sometimes outside an iPod store, or whatever the hell they are. I don't have an iPod. But in those days, they would line up. There'd be 20,000 people sometimes lined up at these stores, not to get a new iPod, but to get a cheap T-shirt or a souvenir, and to see Jerry Carroll, who was like a celebrity.
Jerry Carroll is there, and Larry Weiss is there, and they're all at the opening, and people are crowding around Jerry Carroll. And Eddie Antar is what? He's standing off to the side. Nobody knows who he is.
Yeah, nobody knows who Eddie is. Eddie was very
He's not on the book cover either.
He's not on the book cover. The guy on the book cover, and I'm glad you're showing that. Let me show it again. Retail Gangster. That's Jerry Carroll. That's not Eddie Antar. Eddie Antar is in the book, in one of the photos in the book, but that's not Eddie Antar. No, Eddie Antar was very publicity shy. He didn't give interviews until the very end, and he turned out to be pretty good when he finally gave interviews, but he didn't generally. He almost never gave interviews. He did talk to analysts, which is down the road in our story, but until the company actually went public and until it actually had to talk to Wall Street, Eddie just liked to stay in the shadows. His philosophy was, in obscurity, there is security, and he had a point.
So somebody, just to put up on the chat, do you have a clip? Maybe if somebody goes on and finds a clip of one of the ads, we'll play it for 30 seconds. If I have, Omar may have to help out here. I don't know if I have the technological skill to share it if it comes up, but that would be a fun thing to do. In any case, moving on, as far as Eddie and Crazy Eddie, he's publicity shy. And what kind of a person is, like, I remember Mo Ginsburg, right? The store, Mo Ginsburg's, the suits, if people remember New York. And I'm proud to say that I bought a suit. I think this is the suit. I bought a suit from Mo Ginsburg in 1978 or 79 at his store. And I have a distinct recollection of what he was like. He's he was old then, overweight, gray hair, Jewish guy. And I said, my shoulder, it's not fitting in the shoulder over here. And he says, there's something the matter with your shoulder. And I said, so he sells me a suit thinking there's something wrong with my shoulder, which years later, it turns out there was, it droops. So I have this recollection of him as this figure. What would I think and hear and feel and see if I walked into Kings Highway in 1974 and Eddie Antar was there and he helped me on the floor? Who is he? Is he gregarious? Is he a tough guy? He's muscular.
Yeah. Well, he was sometimes on the sale floor, and sometimes he sold people stuff. He was showing his salesman how to do it. He trained his salesman on how to sell. But if you ran into Eddie at the early Kings Highway store, or if you ran into him in Times Square when he was before Crazy Eddie, when he was just a teenager, and he was working for one of the clip joints, you'd be dealing with a very, very charming, person who wouldn't let you leave until you bought something. Is there a problem? What can I do for you? Would you like to, if you, I don't buy this, buy that. You might not be able to afford this, but you could afford that. He'd want you to leave. If you, and you don't have any money, well, maybe if you could give me $5, he would take a $5 deposit. If you want that, you can afford it, give me a $5 deposit. And you would be dealing with a very, very persistent individual focused on only one thing, selling you something, because his philosophy was, if you're in the store, you are there to buy something. You come to all the trouble. You take all the trouble to go into the store. You are there to buy something. And that's the only thing he'd care about. He wouldn't, there'd be no games. You're here to sit to buy.
You say no games, but he early on he develops a house brand for speakers.
Right.
And he tries to sell you those speakers over Bose speakers. It's just as good as a Bose, and maybe it's even cheaper than a Bose, but he's making 50% margin on that speaker instead of only 20 on the Bose.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Now, one of the things that he would do from the beginning, this is one of the early winding back to 1969, is engage in bait and switch. Now, generally people, when they think of bait and switch, they think of, well, you're being switched to something that's more expensive. That's classic bait and switch. But over time, Eddie developed a line of products, including a house brand speaker, where even though it was cheaper than the name brand product, you'd come in to get a name brand. He would advertise Sony, Panasonic, blah, 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 blah. But you'd go in and he'd want you to buy a cheaper product. And you say, oh, well, that's interesting. Maybe I will buy a cheaper product. And it didn't seem like bait and switch necessarily, but it was, because he'd be making more money on the cheaper product. The cheaper product was actually had a higher profit margin than a Sharp or a Panasonic or a Bose or whatever it is you were buying. And the bait and switch aspect, that was another facet of Eddie's technique from the very beginning until he left.
So tell me about lunch. We're going to get to it. We're going to do a progression of different swindles during this hour here. It's going to go fast, but let's quickly go through some of the swindles. Tell us about lunch. And Michael Robkin, we're going to get to that question about business schools. Don't let me forget about business schools, because I want to get to that question, but let's first get through the swindles. Tell us about lunch.
Well, the whole marketing of Crazy Eddie was built upon brand names. And we have brand names. We got the best brand names. That was one of the Jerry Carroll pitches, and in their early ads, they would say, we can get you a Sony for X amount of money and so forth. Well, people come in, they want the Sony. And like I said, they try to switch you. Well, let's say you won't be switched. No, I'm not going to be switched. Don't you pull that on me. I want the Sony. I want the Panasonic. I want what you had in the paper. I wanted what Jerry Carroll is screaming about. So if they had it in stock, they'd sell it to you. They really would. I mean, if it was in stock, but the chances are it's not in stock, because, this stuff sells out fast. So what would happen is, you might hear, if you go in for this, you go in, you want the name brand, you might hear somebody say, oh, somebody's have lunch. We're going to have lunch now. What that meant is they're going to go into the back. They're going to get a table model, a display model. And it's basically used, usually in sort of poor shape. They'd wipe it up and they get it in the greatest of shape. They put it in a box. They would have pristine boxes in a special spot in back. They put this used model in there. And this model, by the way, might have been returned as defective, but it doesn't matter. They would put this model in bang, they'd wipe it off, they'd put it in the plastic, and they use the right tape or whatever. They say, oh, here it is. Here it is. They called it lunch because this tape and the other things that they used to effectuate this repackaging was kept in it looked like a lunch bag. That's why they called it lunch. Right. And that was one of the things they did to satisfy the customer.
So there's a series of these swindles, and we'll talk about a little bit more, but Omar, are we able to watch that clip? That might be fun if it's a 30-second clip. Can we do that?
Yeah, we can do that.
Let's try. Can you want to do it? Should I hit it and share, or what's?
I can do it.
I'd rather have you do it. If you see it, it's up 2 inches up there.
Yeah, I can bring it up here. And then I'll just share my screen so everyone can see it. Let's see here. Oh, let's see. share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes.
Oh,
Can you all hear it?
No.
I can't hear it.
Okay. Let's see here. Bear with me here while I figure out the.
Check sound bottom left. It says it's on. While we're waiting for that to happen, I want to ask you, Gary, about the floods. Somebody already asked about the floods. Tell us about the floods.
The floods, yes, the floods. Well, wait a second. Is it going on? Perhaps not.
Crazy
You hear it now?
are insane.
Yes.
Get those earmuffs off and listen to this. Crazy Eddie's Christmas blowout blitz is going on now with the lowest sale prices ever on receivers, speakers, turntables, compact displayers, stereo rack systems, anything and everything in audio equipment. Remember, we are not undersold. We will not be undersold. We cannot be undersold, and we mean it. You don't have to ski cross country to get the lowest sale prices on audio equipment, because Crazy Eddie's Christmas audio blowout blitz is going on now at a Crazy Eddie superstore near you. Crazy Eddie, his prices are... Edison came up with lots of great ideas, but nothing as great as a new Crazy Eddie Edison, New Jersey Superstore. Yes, Crazy Eddie's Edison, New Jersey grand opening is going on right now through Sunday. Thousands of free Crazy Eddie t-shirts and baseball caps, and all great Crazy Eddie Superstores are celebrating during Crazy Eddie's grand opening blowout blitz. So come on down to Edison, New Jersey. Thousands of free Crazy Eddie t-shirts and baseball caps. Let Crazy Eddie light up your life with prices that are insane.
All right. Okay, thank you.
It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas.
There are hundreds of these.
No, that's great. Thank you, Omar.
Blowout.
Sure.
That's fantastic.
Save you a blizzard of bucks on giant.
Okay.
We could spend
Thank you.
5 hours. Mainly.
It really does. No, it really does in a way capture an era. Thank you for that. And I think it was Terry. No, who I forget who put it up, but thank you. Let's talk now about the floods.
Yeah, let's talk about floods.
The tragic floods that would occur in warehouses and how they were handled.
Yeah, well, one of the things that happen when you own a store in New York is that floods take place. You know, the leaks will come down. You know, there'll be a flood, and the roof will leak, or a pipe will burst. Or you know, on the other hand, you might also have a burglary. You know, there's a lot of burglaries, a lot of crime, and also a lot of floods. So let's say you had a flood, okay, and Eddie always insured his stores retail price. You know, he bought the most expensive insurance, insured everything at retail price. So there was a flood, and I described one particular instance where there was a flood on Fordham Road in the Bronx, where they had one of their most lucrative stores. Immediately trucks would descend upon the store in the Bronx where there was a flood, where there was any store where there was a flood. They would offload all the merchandise they couldn't sell, all the old stuff. That's the stuff that just wasn't moving up the shelf floor. They take it down and they dump it wherever there was a flood, usually down in the basement. And then they bring out the hoses, fire hoses, and they wet down. So in addition to the stuff that was genuinely flooded, you know, genuinely damaged, you get all this stuff coming in from other stores that was hosed down and flooded. And then what they would do, they call that spiking the claim. And this was how they took advantage of floods and of incidents. And another thing is that they would take this flooded merchandise. The insurance companies could have taken them, but they generally did not. They had merchandise from previous floods they'd bring in, and they put in another claim on it. They kept on recycling these old things that had been previously flooded. And they had an insurance adjuster, a private insurance adjuster working with them. And this became quite a moneymaker for Eddie. Spiking the claim. They would do this also with burglary.
And they had merchandise that was already previously claimed. Yeah. They had a separate warehouse for this. So yeah. We're going to come to many frauds here. But now the chain is growing, and cash flow is coming because of something called NECTI.
NECTI, yeah.
And NECTI is what?
Well, NECTI is skim. It's cash skim. I mean, this is as old as the hills in family-owned businesses in New York City, going back forever. But among the Syrian Jewish merchants, it was known as NECTI. And the Antars would take and we're talking about about stuff that was just basically taken out of the cash register, and the profit, people were paid off the books, and any profit was stored in the ceilings, or they were, it was in latter stages, it got to be very bulky. It was actually sent to Israel and deposited in accounts at Bank Leumi in Israel. So that's Nekti. And Nekti, anticipating your next question, Nekti became a major source of, well, I mean, originally it was a it was used, to evade taxes. You don't have to pay taxes. You don't have to pay taxes on the profits, and you don't have to. Your employees don't have to pay taxes on their income, and everybody loves that kind of thing, except for the government, and the government doesn't know about it. Okay, so this got all this cash going out to Israel, lots of cash. They called it net nekti because what went out to Israel was profits. Okay, now they're not paying taxes, or they're underpaying taxes on the profits. Sometime in 1979, it was decided, we want to go public. Now, in order to go public, you've got to have increasing profits. So that's where one of the protagonists in this story comes to the fore. His name is Sam E. Antar. He is the young cousin of Eddie Antar, Sammy Antar, who had been put through school by Eddie as this family's accountant and as Crazy Eddie's accountant. Sammy comes up with the idea, says, look, we've got all this money in Israel, and we're sending all this money to Israel, but we're shooting ourselves in the foot. You want to show increased profitability before you go public. So let's decrease the amount that we're taking out, decrease it steadily until we go public to show increased profitability. And that's exactly what they did. When they went public in 1984, they had a prospectus, which showed really astonishing profits growth. I mean, the kind of profits growth that would be unheard of. It was unheard of at the time for an electronics retailer. They were making massive profit growth. They were really only making like 2 to 3% profit growth. It was, they were growing, but they weren't growing much because even they were really putting up more stores, so that was increasing their expenses. So they weren't really making profits. But by decreasing the amount of nekti profit.
Oh, you pronounce it nekti.
Nekti. Arabic is. I took elementary Arabic when I was in college.
Third grade,
No, college. Arabic 101, City College. Nekti. They were able to show, instead of 2% profit growth, they showed stuff like 48% profit growth for some years. And
by the way,
wild.
Another even more famous company by the name of General Electric did that through the 80s and 90s, where they would have a huge treasury, and every quarter was consistently 5% up, 5% up, 5% up, 5% up. And it looked great. And what we now know they were doing, speaking of business school, is they were using the treasury to even out the quarters. And so it's not something that's unheard of. But I want to talk about Eddie himself. By now, he's got an enterprise that's bringing in millions of dollars in cash flow, both legitimately and illegitimately. He's from a large extended family with lots of guys named Sam and Eddie. And so everybody is getting a piece of this, and he's effusively sharing his wealth. And he's married to a woman named Debbie Rosen, and she's getting lots of wealth. And he's a wonderful family man and husband and father. Is that right?
Well, she's getting money from him. She's living. Debbie, meaning his first wife, Debbie Rosen Antar. She's actually, he takes good care of her. They have a house at the Jersey Shore, and she's doing very well. But their marriage was disintegrating. Okay, their marriage was disintegrating, and right around the time of the IPO, just as fortune would have it, because Eddie was a philanderer from way back. The marriage was really disintegrating. So he talked her into, he sort of browbeat her into signing a separation agreement that totally screwed this woman. Totally screwed her. She didn't get a nickel off the business, even though there was no prenup. And she had some maintenance, but it was a completely one-sided separation agreement. And he had his cousin not Sammy Antar, but another gentleman who was general counsel of the company. He had
Solomon.
him, was that?
Solomon.
Yeah, I didn't want to mention his name, but all right.
Oh,
He's still with, that's all right. I don't like that. I don't like the name. I don't want to name too many people that it all gets all confusing. I'll put it that way. This gentleman who you just mentioned, he claimed to represent her. He didn't. There was litigation afterwards, but to make a long story short, she didn't get much. She just got some maintenance, minimal child support, and he got unlimited visitation, day or night, no notice. It's unheard of, completely unheard of. So yeah, money was going around, but it wasn't going around so evenly, and it wasn't going around to everybody. And the brothers, Eddie's brothers, were not satisfied with the kind of money they were getting. There was, from the beginning, and there was, his father was, he was a 1/3 owner of Crazy Eddie, and he wasn't happy. You know, there was a lot of friction within the family, practically from the beginning, largely because over money. You know, the classic reason why there's friction within families: money. And also they felt that he treated his wife poorly, which he certainly did. So that was sort of the nucleus. That was the genesis of his eventual downfall.
I'm going to do something that in all the times I've ever talked about books in venues like this and in person, I've never done once. I'm going to read a passage from the acknowledgements. Right? I've never read a passage from the acknowledgements, and I want to have you talk about it a little bit. And it says, I found this story to be a kind of Rashomon tale. To some of the people who knew him, Eddie Antar was and always will be a hero. To others who experienced the same person, Eddie was the embodiment of evil. Some view him as a little of each. My aim was to portray all facets of his persona. But since I necessarily relied heavily on court transcripts and the public record, which are scathingly negative, this book does tilt in that direction. Talk a little bit about the man. One doesn't read the book and come out with a great view of him. Talk about how, in what way was he good, and what were his innovations and so forth.
Yeah, well, you know, as I pointed out, the acknowledgements, you know, the public record is really pretty scathing, because it was, you know, we're talking about court decisions, multiple court decisions, which really were not made him out to be, you know, a cross between Genghis Khan and
Bernie
Madoff. But speaking of Madoff, does anyone say anything positive about Madoff nowadays? That he had charm, that he did anything positive, even though actually he did do some things positive?
Good charity.
Yeah, all right, good charities. Yeah, right. And then they had to claw that back. No one ever talks very positively about the crooks who followed Eddie. I mean, Eddie was unique in that he had a sort of he had almost a cult following among the people who worked for him, who to this day are loyal and talk positively of him, even though some of them suffered and some of them were ripped off by him. And also you have this cultural influence, you know, that when he died in 2016, the obituary says, you know, I think one of the obituaries says, you know, that they were wistful for the time of Crazy Eddie. And this was written by a writer who just went into the stores. You know, he represented an era. And as I said in the acknowledgements, yes, among certain people, he was just the embodiment of evil. You know, and certainly if you look at the public record, if you look at the, by the way, when I say public record, I'm not talking about stuff that you just walk into the library and pick up stuff. You know, I base it upon my book very largely upon depositions that are public record, but not, you know, you pull them off the shelf, or you don't get them off the internet. You know, there's voluminous material in depositions and in the trial transcript, which I had a great deal of difficulty getting. You know, I tried getting a trial transcript after 30 years. I don't mean to whine about it, but it's not so easy. But in the trial transcript, you look at the depositions and you look in the court decisions, which are public, you see a person who really has done no good for anybody. But on the other hand, there's no denying that this man had a real influence on on the time in which he lived, in terms of marketing, in terms of just bringing into the public domain a sort of a character and an image of, he embodied New York City for what it was back in the 70s and 80s, like really very, screaming and yelling and in your face, So, yeah, I mean, he was the embodiment of evil to some people, but on the other hand, you can't really call this man an evil man per se. That's might be a little bit too much.
I think we should have talked about this earlier, but what is the real innovation here? Crazy Eddie's is Crazy Eddie's. I keep saying Crazy Eddie's because that's what we call it, but Crazy Eddie, is the store the first of the super discounters in electronics? Is it the first of all super discounters? Is it the progenitor of the mass super discounter? What is the thing that Crazy Eddie was that was innovative first and different?
Well, he didn't really innovate in the sense of coming up with like a better mouse. He didn't like invent the mousetrap. He came up with a better mousetrap is the way I would put it. I mean, for example, the whole crazy merchant shtick that he used, that's as old as the hills. That dates back forever. But he grabbed that old way of selling and he turned it into something memorable. He may not necessarily, he wasn't always necessarily the first super discounter. There were discount chains before Eddie. There was something called EJ Corvettes, which people have forgotten about. But there were discount chains before Eddie. There were innovators in discounting before Eddie. There were innovators in electronics before Eddie. But what Eddie did was he grabbed the public's consciousness, and I think this is something. This is why he's remembered. Why nobody remembers. Nobody, unless you're a real trivia addict, okay, you're not going to remember Corvettes. I mean, I remember Corvettes. I used to shop there when I was a kid. Nobody remembers Corvettes, but everybody remembers Crazy Eddie. He brought something memorable to New York City, to the country, because it became a nationally recognized symbol of New York.
There's a good question from Irene, a participant here. Did Antar sell gray market? Oh, I was reading it and it went away. Did Antar sell gray market products?
No.
That used to be common. Did he not?
No, he did not. Gray market products were sold mainly out of, at least in New York City. They were sold in like these little import-export stores. There was actually a little stretch of Canal Street which I recall as being called Gray Market Gulch down on Canal Street near the Manhattan Bridge. And this is where all the gray market goods settled. Gray market goods were goods manufactured for import that were diverted for sale in the U.S. and frequently they did not have they did not have U.S. warranties, and they didn't even have the right kind of plugs. Sometimes you had to buy an adapter. It may still have some old gray market goods in the closet.
So where did he get?
He didn't sell goods. I beg pardon?
But where did he get? Now the chain is growing and it's becoming much bigger. Everybody has access and everybody is selling at certain prices. What happened? What changed?
Well, when he first got into business, he had to really scramble and scrounge for merchandise because the manufacturers would not sell to him. I mean, going back to around 1969, 1970, thereabouts, in the early 70s, the manufacturers would not sell to him. And they could get away with it because the law allowed them to. There's something called the fair trade laws, permitted manufacturers to discriminate against discounters, not sell to discounters and dictate their prices. So he had to get around. He had to scrounge for merchandise. One of the places that he bought merchandise from, which I describe in the book, was a place called Corner Distributors in the Bronx. That was one of his principal suppliers. They would sell him merchandise a little bit above wholesale, and this was name brand stuff that he couldn't get anywhere else. Corner Distributors, which was a perfectly legitimate retailer of electronic goods, a very large operation on White Plains Road. Corner Distributors was their main legitimate business. They were also a numbers bank. They were an immense numbers bank. It was basically a mafia operation that had as one of their ancillary operations an electronics chain. So basically, they bought from a numbers bank in the Bronx. That was the type of operation that they bought from. They had a scrounge. But over time, the manufacturers did sell to them.
Somebody asked the question: was he known as Crazy Eddie before the Crazy Eddie persona that Jerry made famous that we just watched?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. And that's a very good question. He started to use the crazy persona in 1972 in ads in the Village Voice. Really great ads in the Village Voice. Sometime around 71, 72, he came up with this crazy persona. Like I said, it wasn't new to original to him, and he started to put these really sort of unique, kind of kooky ads in the Village Voice to appeal to a youth market. So that was 1972, and Jerry Carroll only came along in like 1976. So it was a good 4 years. Good 4 years.
So he did have stores. As a kid, was he known as Crazy Eddie or not?
No, he was not as Crazy Eddie. And he resented, he didn't like being known as a crazy person. One of this guy, Larry Weiss, no relation, who hired Jerry Carroll, and who came up with a lot of the commercials. He said, he once came to Eddie with a commercial script. He says, Crazy Eddie, the man is insane. That was the script that and Eddie said, what are you talking about? I'm not insane. How dare you? So they changed it to Crazy Eddie. The prices are insane. He didn't like being known as a crazy person. And he wasn't crazy, believe you me.
So you mentioned the numbers racket and the store that he was buying from.
Yeah.
And the book does read in some ways, because of the infighting and because of the family loyalties and the ties, and because it's a large and growing family business based on swindles. It has that sort of mafia, Sicilian mafia feel to it, but there's no violence.
True.
I don't mean to give away the ending here to anybody, but nobody dies horribly here.
Yeah,
Right.
no, that doesn't.
So
is
that part of the culture? Does this happen to be a peaceful family? Or I keep thinking when I'm reading it that one of these guys is going to be knocked off.
Well, the thing you got to keep in mind, though, is that when organized crime functions smoothly, it usually doesn't. But when things are going pretty well in organized crime, when and things are people are making money, and there's no violence, there's no need for violence. When things are going fairly smoothly, as a matter of fact, one of the guys who worked for Eddie, just by coincidence, to address your point, is a fellow named Vinny Badalamenti. He was actually one of the guys in the stores. He went on to become a major leader, acting boss at one point, street boss of the Bonanno crime family. And one of his interesting characteristics, he was like a nice guy, but after he left Crazy Eddie, which I call the best thing that ever happened to him, that he left Crazy Eddie when he did. He went into the Bonanno crime family, and he was later indicted, the way these guys always are, but he was never indicted for anything violent. It was always for loan sharking and for this, but it was nothing got him killing anybody. Okay. And, while there is murder in the real mafia, if smart gangsters don't kill people, don't hit people, because who the hell wants to do that? You have to pay people to hit people, that kind of thing. By the same token, but Eddie, was not, he was a racketeer. He was eventually found guilty of racketeering, but he was not that kind of racketeer, So you got to keep in mind, there's the sort of the preconceived notion that people have of the mafia, which is a little, not quite as violent as people necessarily think it is. Plus the reality of Crazy Eddie is a non-mafia racketeering enterprise.
So we get to the public offering, which is, I think, 83 by the time what's that?
84.
84, 83, right? It's all like yesterday to us. Okay. So we get to the public offering, and all of a sudden with the prospectus, which is the materials that you're using to sell to the public, the game is no longer to skim cash, but to elevate the perceived growth and volume of business.
Right.
And so now you're getting a bigger and bigger business, and they do things with the inventory, right? They're doing all kinds of things to elevate how much inventory they have and how much they're selling. And Wall Street is in on it or is not in on it, or what's the dynamic? Now you have investors and you have analysts, and the analysts love Crazy Eddie.
Yeah. Well, you see what happened was, the run up to the IPO in 1984, they were cutting down on the skim to make their profits seem great, increasing the skim, making the profits. The profit growth was 2%. They made it 48% in 1 year, that kind of thing. So, okay, so they go public. Analysts love them. Wall Street loves them. Oh, they were like a real. Today they would be known as a memes, MEME. How do you pronounce that? Meme stock. Nowadays they'd be like that. They'd be like AMC. They'd be like that. I mean, everybody would be falling in love with them. And people, the stock skyrocketed. What's that?
CRZY is the ticker symbol.
CRZY was the ticker symbol. That's right. Okay, so they go public. Okay. Based largely upon fraud, not upon real growth, but imaginary, made-up growth. Okay, so Wall Street's going to want to continue to see that. You can't just say, "Well, we're going back to normal. We're going to show 2% growth." No. They had to continue. So, in order to show increased growth, and mind you, Eddie was the top shareholder. He didn't want to hold on to all that stock. He wanted to dump it. He wanted to dump that damn stock. He knew that the company was built on a house of cards. So they had to start fabricating they had to start, puffing up and fabricating the financial statements, which they did, as you point out, through the warehouses. You see, in order to one of the easiest ways to fabricate profit is to inflate the value of what's in your warehouses at the end of any particular fiscal quarter, because of a formula that's used in accounting, which is not known to most people. That if you have a lot in your warehouses, the higher of the material, higher stock that you have in the warehouses, the more profits you're making. That's according to it. To a formula in accounting. So by inflating what's in the warehouses, they were able to inflate their profits.
Mm-hmm. And so this gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Right.
And now it starts to become almost impossible to maintain that, because you have a $3 million fraud in Q1, then you have a $6 million fraud. All of a sudden, and meanwhile, in the mid 80s, other companies are catching up to Crazy Eddie.
Exactly.
And so talk about how it comes to a crashing end.
You see, because other companies, because Eddie, was able to break the back of the fair trade laws. They repealed the fair trade laws, and basically Eddie was largely, I think, responsible for the fact that these fair trade laws were, outmoded and ridiculous. Now he's got competition. Now other people are eating his lunch, so to speak. So he's getting competition from this chain and that chain and this chain, and that's cutting into his profits. So Wall Street, they're interested in what they call same store sales, comp store sales. They want to see, is Crazy Eddie growing because people are marching into the stores and putting money into the cash registers, or are they growing because there's more stores? They're growing because there's more stores. They don't care for that. Is there more? So they had to fabricate these comp store sales. And they did that through a form of money laundering. They started to pump money into the individual store accounts from Israel, where they still had Nekti, they still had cash in Israel, from Israel through Panama, back up to New York City. They call that the Panama pump, pumping cash into the individual stores. But even then, it was hard to continue the warehouse fraud. It was just getting to be too big.
And then they had somebody that was buying $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a week worth of merchandise to sell it to other stores to artificially pump up retail sales, all kinds of things. And so
all sorts of stuff. Yeah, they started. Yeah, they were really. It was a basket case because of the fraud. They had to do all kinds of things, which really wasn't helping the business. They screwed up their inventories. As you point out, one of the people that they were selling, they sold stuff to a cooperative wholesaler. He's a retailer selling to a wholesaler. They sell stuff to a wholesaler, and he allowed them to sort of manipulate the way they carried out these sales, the date of the sales, so to make it seem as if it was a different date and whatever. And it was just not working. The fraud just was no longer working.
So ultimately, it catches up with them, and they have to come clean.
Mm-hmm.
And at this time, other companies are they were looking for a company to come in and buy them that was not gonna turn them in, right? They wanted somebody who was an equal crook who was gonna buy them, and that didn't happen. So ultimately it collapses. And so now we get to the business school question. And I've had this in mind for 45 minutes here. Is this ultimately, I forget who asked the question, it was about 12 inches ago on the chat. Is this ultimately just a matter like any other triangle scheme or pyramid scheme or Ponzi scheme that you keep having to add and add, and when it collapses of its own weight, you get caught? Or is there something deeper to this for business school audience? It seems to combine a lot of elements of things.
It certainly has an element of a pyramid scheme because you just couldn't continue this fraud forever, and it was going to eventually collapse. But it wasn't predestined to collapse. The reason the reason they eventually collapsed is because they were taken over. And the reason they were taken over is because the stock price fell because of all this competition. So the stock price fell. That made them fodder for a takeover bid. And eventually a couple of very, very unlucky guys came in and took them over, believed what was in the financial statements, took them over, and they realized this is crap. But had they been taken over the way they wanted it to be taken over, if it had been taken over by a cooperative takeover artist who wasn't going to look too closely at their books, the fraud they could still be in business. The fraud might have been just another Antar family secret. So it was not predestined to fail.
So Eddie Antar absconds to Israel.
Right.
And now he's a fugitive. Right? And so what happens? How does he get caught?
Yeah. He as things were starting to collapse, Eddie realized, I'm not going to stick around. Who wants to stick around when you're running a fraud, which is horrible, a horrible fraud, and it means you're going to go to jail. He didn't want to go to jail, so he got all his money put aside. He sent it to Israel, and he followed his money to Israel. He became a citizen of Israel, and he not only became a citizen of Israel, but he created an alias, and he made his alias a citizen of Israel. Now, he figured that he's a citizen of Israel, he's going to be protected by the Israeli government, because after all, he's a Jewish person, and, and he figured, it's never turned out to be true. Criminals have not been protected by the Israeli government, but he figured, I'm going to be protected by Israel, and that'll be fine. But Israel didn't like that he made his alias into a citizen. Now, you're not supposed to do that. One citizenship per person, So they cooperated with the U.S. government, and Eddie made a fatal error. I think they would have caught him eventually, but he tried to reclaim some money from Switzerland. In so doing, he presented a passport that he had from Brazil, a phony passport from Brazil, in which his birth date was his genuine Eddie Antar birth date was in the material that he gave to the Swiss government. And contrary to popular belief, and contrary to Eddie's belief, Swiss bank secrecy is not all it's cracked up to be. The U.S. government, they cooperated with the U.S. government. The U.S. government found out about this Brazilian passport and this account that he had in Switzerland with Eddie Antar's birth date, and that led them to Israel. And the rest is history.
So two different camps of people who are going to be in trouble cooperate with federal authorities and with the SEC. There's both civil lawsuits by the government and criminal lawsuits by the Justice Department. Well, they're all the government, by SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. So there's all these investigations going on. And tell us about the competing whistleblowers.
Yeah, well, the first guys to come to the government as things were starting to collapse, when things collapse in a fraud, informants, ordinarily, as in any criminal enterprise, ordinarily informants they don't want to go to prison. Nobody wants to go to prison. So a couple of guys named Spindler and Greenberg, who are mentioned in the book, they went to the SEC first, and they spilled their guts within reason. They did not. They told their story in such a way that they did not incriminate. They incriminated Eddie Antar, And they incriminated his cousin, Sam E. Antar, the cousin, but no other members of the family. And they also didn't know, they did not talk about any of the money laundering frauds and this Panama pump and blah, blah, blah. So they went to the SEC, and then from the SEC, they went to the feds, to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And they were adopted by the U.S. Attorney's Office, like a puppy or a long lost cousin. They became the pet informants of the SEC and of the federal government. So when Sam E. Antar realized, I gotta go to the government. I'm going to tell the truth. I have the whole story. I am, after all, the chief financial officer. I've got the whole story. When he went there, he found that these two guys were in effect sort of there before him. And the prosecutor, the then prosecutor at the time, said, I don't need you, Sammy Antar. You're lying. This stuff about the Panama pump, that's a lot of baloney. I don't need you. If you can want to plead guilty, fine, but you're going to go to prison. I have my two informants. They're terrific. I don't need you. Go away. And that's how it began. That was basically the beginning of the Crazy Eddie prosecution, sort of in a slapstick manner.
So we don't have time to go through the whole case, but he's found guilty by a jury.
He is, Eddie Antar.
And then quickly, because it's 8:00, and I know Omar is going to get on, and I think the next book talk starts at 8. So just quickly, he's found guilty and he's sentenced to 51 months in prison. But what happens?
Whatever it is. Well, there's this long trial, 2-week trial. He's convicted. He's sentenced to prison. He appeals. You figure, it's not that often that if convictions are overturned, and it was overturned. The guy, there had been a colloquy at the bench where the judge had made comments that the appellate court interpreted as being prejudicial to Eddie, and they threw the conviction out. They threw out the conviction of Eddie and his brother. So that was that. But they assigned the case. They tossed the judge out, but they got in another judge who was just as tough. Judge Harold Ackerman was very tough. So they decided to plead guilty, which they
Question from Ethel. We know that a lot of money ultimately was recovered over the years, and that would have gone not to shareholders and not really to family members, but it would have gone to investors. But was the question from Ethel was money hidden or given quietly to his children?
First of all, money did go to shareholders. The SEC was in charge of sort of tracking down the money, and they found, I forget the exact number, but by about 10 years ago, they terminated this, or about 15 years ago, they had found they found a lot of money, and they gave it on to the shareholders. They did a pretty good job. As to whether Eddie had cash that he's put aside, that he squirreled away, did other family members benefit from this cash? We can only speculate.
So Eddie dies, and we're wrapping up. If there are more questions, put them in the chat. Eddie dies in 2016. And oddly, yes, there's some nostalgia around Crazy Eddie when he dies, but he himself never becomes a Darryl Strawberry like New York celebrity. It's Crazy Eddie, the company, that is the sort of celebrity, and he doesn't have a lot of that celebrity power, which is what he wanted. If you had gotten a chance to talk with him for this book, which didn't happen because most of it was reported afterward and so forth, how would the book have been different if he had gotten a chance to lie to you too?
Well, if he had a chance to lie to me, then I would have had to report his lies. Look, had he, obviously I'd have wanted to talk to him, but I would have had, more. I would have had his side of the story. I would have had, since basically everything came out of his mouth was a lie. For a guy like him, you really want to rely more upon the facts that are set forth in public documents than his lies. I don't think there was very much of a loss that I wasn't able to talk to him.
What happened to Jerry Carroll?
He died very quietly. He was a very shy man. And in 2020, he died. Now, he died in secret. It's funny, a man with his public persona, he passed out of the world in silence. There was no obituary. There was no death notice. He was just quietly cremated. There was not even any church ceremony or anything. He just faded away.
Well, we're wrapping up, and I want to ask you one last question, and that is the rise and fall of Crazy Eddie is in many ways really a tale of the excesses of the 20th century and the gritty culture of the late 20th century in New York. Could this have happened? Can it be happening now in the 21st century?
Oh, yeah, of course it can. Sure.
Oh.
But there's no way of knowing. I mean, you don't know for sure. I mean, look, go back in time to 1977. Could you possibly believe that Eddie was a criminal? He didn't seem like a criminal. He was running a business that was. In order to know that something like that is happening, you need inside information, and ordinarily, inside information only takes place afterwards. Years.
Well, that's a great place to end. I want to thank all of our participants and Omar and the Mark Twain House. And
thank you for having me.
It's been great. And Gary Weiss especially. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Love being here.
Thank you so much, Gary and Dan. That was really, really cool. Especially for those of us who lived post Crazy Eddie times. Yeah, that was amazing. And thank you for all the folks in the audience for joining us. And if you joined us late or want to go back, you can rewatch the program on our YouTube channel. I put a link in the chat. You can also check out our events page to see all of our upcoming programs. We have a variety of programs coming up. Also just want to let people know that we're going to have museums for Sunday. Crazy Eddie's is no longer open, but you can come down to the Mark Twain House where the deals are going to be insane. No, not really, but you could come.
They're going to be insane.
Yeah, Sunday, November 27th. We're going to have free snacks and drinks, festive music, discounts at our store, activities for the whole family, dramatic readings with historic interpreters, and holiday tours of the house. It's all going to be above board. And come experience the holidays with us at the Mark Twain House and Museum. So again, thanks so much, audience. Thanks so much, Dan and Gary. And hope you all have a good evening.
And a shout out to Mr. Cronin.
Tony Cronin?
Please.
He's here. He is in the house.
Wow, that's insane.
Insane. Thank you, Omar.
Okay. Please buy the book. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.